Well, welcome everybody. I'm delighted to see you all. I'm David Myers. I teach in the history department, and I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA. We're really thrilled to welcome to UCLA a distinguished historian and dear friend and colleague, John Efron, who holds the Corrett Chair in Jewish History at UC Berkeley. John is one of the country's leading historians of modern Jewry and German Jewish history, and the author of a number of important books that include Defenders of the Race, Jewish Doctors in Race, Science and Fantasy Europe, Medicine and German Jews, a History, The Jews, a History. There's a common theme, history. Some of us are familiar with that book. All those who are familiar with that book, maybe even have read from it in the last week, please raise your hand. Okay, good, excellent. And the book we'll be discussing today, which is called All-Consuming German Jews and the Meaning of Meat. John and I also joined together to co-edit a volume along with our colleague Elisheva Karlbach in honor of our great mentor, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, which is to say that we have known each other for 40 years, met in graduate school as young graduate students, and for as long as I have known John, he has been a great lover of meat. That love was cultivated in the kitchen of his mother, who was, as you will read when you buy the book and make your way through the introduction, a great interpreter of Ashkenazic and Yiddish seasoned cuisine. So John's love of meat came from his mother, a great producer of fine meat products, and I would say from your fellow Australians who are a meat-loving lot. In fact, I remember in graduate school, John informed me that in Australia, chicken is considered a vegetable. Just how seriously they take their meat.
Very serious.
It turns out chicken was considered parve in some early Jewish kitchens, as we read in the Mishnah. So it was kind of natural, and I might even say overdue, that John would take up the subject of meat, by which I mean the meaning, the customs, the delights, and the weaponization, as we will see, of meat for Jews in German-speaking lands. The result in this book is really an extraordinary read. It tells us much more than we might expect. It tells us about Jewish culinary and social habits. It tells us about economic norms, and it tells us about relations between Jews and non-Jews in a variety of settings at different time periods, including in the most difficult and, in some sense, ignominious chapter, when we see that Nazi officials take up with great gusto the long-standing campaign against the ritual practice of shechita, of ritual slaughter, according to the laws of kashrut, of kosher slaughter. But what I want to emphasize is that we are really treated to a master jaunt through medieval and modern Jewish history by someone whom I regard as an historian's historian, whose deft use of sources is really paralleled by an incredibly felicitous and engaging writing style. And this book has the great merit of making a subject about which we might not have thought we were so interested into one of the most fascinating subjects you can imagine. So I really encourage you all to purchase the book, and if you don't purchase it, at least to borrow it from a library so that you can learn about all the ways in which meat has made a difference in the lives of Jews and others. As we've decided, John will introduce the book for 15 or 20 minutes. Then he and I will have an opportunity to discuss it, and then we'll open to conversation amongst us all. And so without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Professor John Efron.
Okay. Thank you everyone for coming. I know this is a center that puts on talks by the dozens, and so there's a lot of competition for attention. So I'm grateful that you've come, and thanks to David for the invitation, and also to Chelsea and the rest of the staff here who have made my visit possible. So thank you. So as a way of by way of introduction to what will be a conversation that we'll have, and that I'll have with David, and hopefully everyone else too will participate. I'll say a few words about the impetus for the book, the subjects that I cover in it, and the general thesis. So when I came to write, how it started out is by asking myself two questions. One was, why write a book about meat? Right? It's not the normal subject. And second, the second question was, why write a book about the way Germans and Jews perceived each other, the meat of each other's meat, and then in turn perceived each other through the lens of their respective meats. And as to the first question, why meat? Well, meat is important, it's crucial, it's consumption, and now I'm going way back before there were Jews, but its consumption occasioned the first great diet change in hominins about 2.6 million years ago, and then with Homo erectus, which was about 1.8 million years ago, it played a crucial role in human development from a physiological, a social, and a cultural point of view, because at that point you need things like cooperation, strategization, hunting parties, the kinds of things that made us human were helped along in that process significantly by the pursuit and hunt for meat. So meat has, to greater and lesser extents, been a central part of the diet of most humans throughout history. As I just alluded to, beyond being a source of nourishment, all food, but especially meat, is rich in meanings and symbols. Indeed, whether consumed or avoided, meat carries particularly potent connotations, both positive and negative. It can engender delight as easily as it can evoke feelings of dread. Indeed, meat might be said to be a mode of ordering the world. It represents a moral, ethical, religious, ritualistic, aesthetic, gustatory, communicative, artistic, and linguistic network of ideas, practices, and attitudes. And in the book, I look at meat through the lens of those categories. As for the book itself, the fact that there isn't another study like it makes it unusual, but that unusualness is more attributable to the way historians approach the Jewish past than, I think, the topic itself. The book falls into a few different historiographical paradigms, among them the history of food, obviously Jewish history, and more specifically German Jewish history and German Jewish studies. As for food history, a trend in that field has been to focus on a single commodity. So there are now extremely informative histories of things like cheese, herring, salt, vanilla, sugar, milk, tea, coffee, cocoa, coconuts, pineapples, and ice cream even. What makes food such an engaging topic for historians is that food is far more than just sustenance. So just to give you one example, there's a history of bananas, right? So the bananas that we eat, they're not just full of potassium, they're full of history. The history of food deals with big topics, including imperialism, global trade, big business, shipping, war, national identity, taste, ecology, technology, and the environment. So just to stick with the banana, its history would fit easily into most of those categories I just listed. Food history also deals with human-animal relations, the latter being a sine qua non for any study involving Jews and meat. Now, while there have been anthropological studies of Jewish foods, historians have been slow to take up the subject. There are a few general reference works on the history of Jewish food, and there are books on Jewish foodways in the Bible and articles as well, and the Talmud, and some cursory works on the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. As for the modern period, there's some scholarship and quite a lot of popular literature on American Jewish foodways, but almost nothing in the field of modern European Jewish history. And there are barely any works in the writing of modern Jewish history like those books to which I just alluded, where there is a focus on a single foodstuff. For the most part, food has not been regarded as a worthy subject of research by modern Jewish historians, despite the fact that the complex legal edifice that is the dietary laws has, since time immemorial, governed every aspect of what Jews can and cannot eat, how their food should be prepared, how it is to be served, and when they can and cannot eat. These foodways have been fundamental to the formation of Jewish identity, which makes the lack of attention paid to it all the more glaring, given that the question of Jewish identity is one of the central preoccupations of Jewish historians, irrespective of the period they study. Many cultures have rules about who may eat meat and when, and which parts may be consumed and in what order certain parts may be eaten. Some cultures abhor meat, while others refuse some meats but not all meat. Whatever the case, meat is of universal significance. In the words of the anthropologist Mary Douglas, humans and nature are always confronting each other face to face, but never more so than at the division of the meat. In Judaism, obviously, meat is of paramount importance, for it constitutes the very focal point of the dietary laws and serves as one of the most visible markers of Jewish distinctness and social separation. It's an object of tangible, touchable, and tasteable difference like no other. And now, my second question, to remind you, was why write a book about the way Germans and Jews have perceived each other's meats? First, Germans are in no way to be credited with formulating Christian ideas about the meat of the Jews. For early Christians, meat, the consumption of meat, was liberation from the shackles of Jewish law. They could live according to the word of Jesus, who said to the crowd, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand, there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile." Or with greater specificity, you can turn to Paul, who said, "Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it." However, the contentiousness over meat played out longer and more heatedly in Germany than anywhere else. Now, in this study, I contend that from the Middle Ages on, the meaning of meat in Germany as both an object of totem and taboo has played a crucial role in interactions between Christians and Jews, as well as among Jews. Germany offers a particularly rich backdrop against which to view the contested culture of meat and its role in the formation of ethnic identities, both German and Jewish. To an extent not seen elsewhere in Europe, in art, text, law, scholarship, politics, commerce, and popular culture, Germans have identified, thought about, studied, decried, and gladly eaten the meat of the Jews. Likewise, Jews in Germany thought about, studied, sometimes decried, and vigorously defended their meats and the culture and rituals surrounding them by educating Germans and Jews alike about their meaning and relevance. So the structure of the book is, it's arranged chronologically and thematically. It runs from the Middle Ages to the modern period. And I take on, I'm going to talk about the topics of the chapters, and then we can move on to a discussion. So I begin with sort of the main character. If there's a protagonist in this, it's the Jewish butcher. The tale of the butcher in Germany is a very long one. It goes maybe 700, 800 years from the time he's first mentioned in the medieval sources all the way to the Third Reich. The butcher played roles of real cultural and economic significance. Over that very long time span, he wore a variety of caps. So in the Middle Ages, the religious social order in Jewish society was divided into three strata. Rabbis and scholars occupied the top rung, followed by a middle rung made up of religious functionaries, the cantor, the synagogue crier, the synagogue beadle, and the scribe, while the ritual slaughterer, the shochet, was to be found in the third and lowest tier of the Jewish social order. But despite his lowly status, the shochet was the embodiment of social contradictions. Expected to slaughter animals in scrupulous accordance with the complex dietary laws of kashrut, the Jewish community placed an enormous amount of trust in those they accorded little honour. Jewish butchers sold their meat, for the most part, unrestricted at medieval meat markets, where it was bought by Jews as well as non-Jews, the latter in defiance of official church pronouncements. This is one of the main themes of the book, the extent to which meat not only divided, or kosher meat, that is to say, but brought Christians and Jews together in an act of economic and social codependency. Within the Jewish community, there are many themes within the Middle Ages, and I'll just pick a couple of them. One is sort of the place of Jews in the medieval meat markets. Another one happened with the devastation that was visited upon German Jewry during the Black Death from 1348 to 1350. What happened after the destruction of those communities is that there was a rearguard action by the surviving German rabbinate, which already felt that it was losing its status as the premier community in Ashkenaz, Germany being Ashkenaz itself, the name for Germany being Ashkenaz, that it was losing its status to Polish Jewry. There was the production of these, and so one of the things that happened is that there was an emphasis on scrupulous observance of all the laws, and they produced these books of customs, Minhagbücher they were called, which stressed the sort of the pious and punctilious observance, the need for punctilious observance of every form of Jewish practice. We see a guy emerge by the name of, in wake of the Black Death, Jakob Weil, and Weil only produced one set of responsa, 200 responsa, and about 100 years after he had passed away, in Prague, a copy of his responsa was found, and at the back was a book of called Shchitos and Bedikos, meaning slaughtering, animal slaughter, and inspection. And he produced a book that has been produced hundreds of times, and it is basically the way that Ashkenazim slaughter to this very day. So there's a medieval history that has a very, very long afterlife that we still live with. A meat-centered German Jewish afterlife, and in the 19th century, look at this chapter goes from the Middle Ages through to the modern period. In the 19th century, we see slaughtering manuals in German. And which is very interesting because these are all meant to be in Hebrew. They've typically and traditionally been in Hebrew, but for the first time we begin to see these slaughtering manuals written in the vernacular. So that first of all constitutes a new genre of Jewish literature. Why were they in this? So German Jewry, up until the end, really up until the Nazis came to power, while heavily concentrated in the big cities in Berlin and Munich and Hamburg and whatnot, still probably had about 50% of people living in rural communities, in villages. And in those rural communities and villages, they couldn't sustain a shochet, and there were people who volunteered to become itinerant shochtim, itinerant slaughterers, but they couldn't read the Hebrew manuals. So they needed German manuals in order for them to take up this sense of obligation, or to fulfill the sense of obligation that they felt towards the community. And another theme that extends from the Middle Ages also to the 1930s was the ubiquitous presence of Jews in Germany in the cattle trade. The Jewish cattle merchant was a ubiquitous character. Let me do this. In the early modern period, about 350,000 head of cattle traversed Europe from Denmark down to the Netherlands and then went east through Russia and through Poland and then into Russia. And at least 250,000 of the 350,000 animal cows bound for slaughter all went through German territories, with very large numbers herded by Jews. We can get a sense of the ubiquitousness of the German Jewish cattle dealer from a Yiddish poem that was from the 17th century. It was written by Judah Leib ben Moses of Zelachov, who was a Polish Jew who was also a cantor in Germany. And he wrote a very long moralistic poem in which he decries the religious laxity of German Jews. And we later on, there's a theme in German Jewish and East European Jewish relations with German Jews looking down upon East European Jews, but we never hear the other side of the story, and East European Jews didn't sit around and take it. They gave as good as they got in the modern period. But in the 17th century already, we have Moshe of Zelachov writing this, decrying German Jews for their for prioritizing business over piety, drunkenness over sobriety, and who attend more closely to their cattle than they do to their prayers. And this is what he said, and this is in translation for you. And they talk a lot of nonsense and foolishness about business and merchandise, about cattle, horses, oxen and cows, also about sheep, lambs, rams and goats. As soon as they get out of bed in the morning, they run to the barn to see which beast is skinny and which is fat. And before they even take a tallis or a tefillin in their hands, they go to the animal and grasp it and feel it. And as Sabbath comes to a close in the synagogue, they've recited Havdalah, that's Sabbath's closing ceremony. There lies the animal, already bound and maltreated, and they don't even wait until shul is over to drag the shochet out of his house. Right. So this is this poem that really indicates just how common a character in Germany the Jewish cattle dealer was in his presence. Finally, in the 19th century, with the Jewish butcher, or actually, this is about the non-Jewish butcher. German Jews, because they lived in such small communities, they couldn't sustain kosher butcher shops. They couldn't sustain them economically, and Christian butchers agreed to set aside parts of their stores to sell kosher meat, which entailed the development of all sorts of metal seals to distinguish their meat from the kosher meat. But it's a great form of cooperation, and they supplied kosher meat to the communities. So that's how the book begins. I then move on to talk about religious sensibilities, meat and religious sensibilities. So despite the relative fairness of the rules that governed the meat markets, where Jews were given a very fair shake, I think. There weren't many places. There were some places where there were restrictions, but for the most part, the rules were designed to provide Christian butchers and Jewish butchers with the means of earning a living. It's pretty windy. So at the same time that you have this real life economic and social cooperation, you have very deep-seated religious beliefs shared by Jews and Germans about each other's meat. Germany is home. One of the reasons that this story doesn't play out in other places is that Germany is home to a number of firsts. It's from there that we get some of the first medieval views of the medical impact of the Jewish diet. From early modern Germany, we read the first ethnographic descriptions of Jewish butchery and the organization of the kosher kitchen. And by the 19th century, with the advent of Reform and Neo-Orthodox Judaism, we saw those branches tackle such subjects as the ongoing relevance or perhaps irrelevance of the dietary laws, or even liturgical issues such as the place of the Musaf service and the prayers call for the restoration of the temple and temple sacrifice. Leaders of those movements had to confront the sacrificial cult and what it meant to be calling in the 19th century for the restoration of animal sacrifice. It was a big problem. Non-Jews also weighed in on these subjects because Germany's also the home of modern Protestant biblical criticism. And so figures such as Julius Wellhausen, who set out a periodization of the Hebrew Bible's composition and compilation, stressed that the law of Moses, as contained in the priestly source that he had identified, especially Leviticus, was a later and not an earlier composition. His implication, therefore, was that Judaism did not follow a normative religious trajectory from a sacrificial cult to an ethical religion, but rather the other way round. This was not only a comment on ancient Israel, but on modern Jews in Germany. And already in the 18th century, we see something we don't see anywhere else in Germany. In the debates over Jewish emancipation, only in Germany do we see opponents of Jewish emancipation raise the subject of meat and the positing that kashrut poses an impediment to social integration and therefore Jewish emancipation. Then we move on to the third chapter, which is the campaign against kosher slaughtering. Germany has sort of the longest running, most intense campaign to eliminate kosher slaughter. It's the second country in Europe. The first country is Switzerland, which succeeds in doing it. But in Germany, you can read the parliamentary debates, and the parliamentary debates are amazing because it says what time they begin and what time they end. So the parliamentary debates, they'll start at 1 in the afternoon, and at 6 o'clock, the only subject that is being discussed is kosher slaughter in the Reichstag. Right? It's relentless. It's obsessive. And what's really interesting about it is that the attempts to get rid of kosher slaughter in Germany always failed. Jews had allies in the parliament. There were no Jews in the parliament, but Jews had allies in the parliament, particularly from the Catholic Centre Party. And they always, with liberals, tended to they rallied around Jews. They rallied around the cause of saving kosher slaughter, and they relied on the provisions in the state constitutions and in the national constitution guaranteeing freedom of religion. And so it's a very interesting story that despite the intense lobbying and the intense energy that's put into getting rid of it, Germany remains a place that is safe for kosher slaughter in the 19th century. Then there's a chapter on food itself and meat. One of the things that we get in Germany is another first in Germany. It's the first place to publish kosher cookbooks. And for the most part, they appear between 1850 and 1910. They go into multiple editions. They're almost all written by women, which is very interesting. And they are gigantic. Like the smallest one I found is about 300 recipes. And the largest one I found, 3,759 recipes. Right? They are. But what's great about them, for my purposes, is when you go through them and you can see just how much meat is consumed, and how much of a role meat plays in all of the recipes, including in the desserts, like using schmaltz to bake a cake and things like that. So it gives you a very good window onto the bourgeois kitchen, onto bourgeois mores, bourgeois tastes, bourgeois habits that German Jews express. And so that chapter gives us a sense of how meat played such a central role in the lives of a community that up until relatively recently, up until emancipation, was really quite economically marginal. And then very, very quickly, like Germany itself, when it industrialized in the 1880s and within 20 years became an industrial giant, Jews too similarly became better off. And one way that's reflected is in their diet. But it also runs parallel to German meat consumption, which tripled over the course of the 19th century. So, as the country goes, so too do its Jews, but with slight differences as well. Then there's a chapter on Nazi Germany. On April the 21st, 1933, the Nazis banned kosher slaughter. Hitler himself signed the thing. And this is interesting. April 21st, 1933 is about 11 weeks after he came to power. You would think that there would be more important things to do, even just in terms of persecuting the Jews. but it's a measure of its importance, of how high up it is or how close it is to his coming to power. And also, puts into question whether this was just a sort of a racial anti-Semitism or whether there were still religious elements involved in it as well, and that kind of thing. Anyway, it's banned on April 21st, 1933, and you would think that that's the end of the story, but actually it's just the beginning of the story. As the Nazis, because kosher slaughter was tailor-made for Nazi propaganda, and so really graphic and gruesome pictures that are most widely spread in children's books. Very colourful, arresting photos that grab your eye, very sort of nicely drawn, if I can put it that way, but really would prove very attractive to children. And the country is just flooded with these really gruesome pictures of kosher slaughter, and also Jewish cattle dealers. And so, and there's more to be said about that. And also Jewish cattle dealers in Germany have their own Jewish patois called La Chudish, which is sort of Lashon Kodesh, the Holy Tongue. And then I conclude with the return of kosher meat to Germany. And the last chapter is Germany, at the end of the war, has 250,000 Jews that are, for the most part, Polish, and most part had spent the war in Russia, and they were in DP camps. They had no future, they had nowhere to go, they'd lost everything. And the aid agencies and the US Armed Forces, who had to be talked into it but went along, it was the American Joint Distribution Committee and various other agencies believed that one of the things that would help sort of rehabilitate these Jews who had suffered so terribly would be to sort of get their religious lives in order. And a sine qua non for their religious lives being in order was to get kosher meat. And bringing kosher meat back to Germany for the first time in 12 years is quite a dramatic story that involves, as I said, the cooperation with the US Army anyway, and bringing it back. And then the very sort of final coda is the current attempts to get rid of halal slaughter in Germany. Resemble in the contours of the campaign, the language of the campaign, everything that the anti-Schita forces of the 19th century expressed. So Germany still has a problem, I would say, with the meat of the other, the ethnic other. Okay, so that's... I hope that didn't take too long. But,
okay, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to start, jump right in.
Yeah.
I do want to say before we do that, actually, that this talk is part of the Levy Center's Naftalin Family Program on Studies in Jewish Identity, and that copies of the book will be available for purchase after. But let's talk about meat as a regulator of identity, not just the regulation of meat, but meat as a regulator, because I was really struck by one of the sources that you made use of that I want to talk about even further. These ethnographies, these 75 ethnographies of Jewish ritual practice that emerge in the early modern period that become such a magnificent trove of material about Jewish practice and the way it was perceived. But I was struck by a statement by a non-Jewish author of one of these ethnographies who summarized Jews and the Jewish experience in one Hebrew word.
Right.
Lahavdil.
Lahavdil.
To distinguish or separate or segregate. His name was Johann Jakob Schutt.
Schutt. Yeah.
Could you explain what he meant and why you included this why you linked this to your discussion of meat? That is to say, what's the symbolic and actual import of that impulse to separate that we can connect to meat? I mean, there are all sorts of layers that I can see.
Right.
Right. There's kashrut. There are the dietary regulations.
Yeah.
There are the attempts to limit. Meat and regulation seem to go hand in hand, and meat as a source of distinction.
Yeah.
By those consumers, by those who want to stigmatize consumers. Anyway, how do you understand Schutt's statement?
Meat. Just. One point is the meat markets in medieval Europe were the most highly regulated places in the commercial
By local
world.
officials.
By local officials. Yeah, they're highly regulated.
For hygiene, for economic competition,
for all of that kind of stuff. That you're not selling dog, when you're supposed to be selling beef or
Carrion.
something like that. Yeah, all of that sort of stuff. Right. So the health reasons and just for protection of customers. So Johann Jakob Schutt was an 18th century Hebraist, Orientalist, a leading scholar who wrote a 4-volume, massive 4-volume work on the ethnography of the Jews, and it goes back and forth between sort of straight description and pretty hardcore anti-Semitic depictions. But in the section where he has a chapter on, the title of the chapter is "On the Stench of the Jews of Frankfurt." And it's a discussion of Jewish uncleanliness, as he sees it, and the paradigmatic figure that he holds up as representing the unclean Jew is the Jewish butcher. And he describes the blood-stained and the feces-stained and the urine-stained apron that he wears, and takes this as sort of being normative of Jewish habits of cleanliness and that kind of thing. But he attributes to the need for as if a non-Jewish butcher wasn't just as dirty, but that's the whole point here. There's something sort of said to be exceptional about it. But the way the Jews organize their lives, and this is a very, the sum total of the 4 volumes provides a very rich depiction of the Jews of Germany and of Frankfurt in particular. And in everything that they do is different. Everything that they do differentiates, as he sees it, right? They do very similar things. They just do them differently, but they're the same sorts of thing. They born, they live, they die, they get married, that kind of thing, their childbirth. He describes all of these life cycle things, but the way he describes them, of course, is in a way intended to accentuate the very difference of Jews and their sort of incompatibility. And nothing represents this to a greater degree, as far as he's concerned, than meat, the meat consumption. Now, in that case, he follows the great, really great scholar of the Hebrew Bible at the same time, Johann David Michaelis. Michaelis is a professor of Hebrew Bible at Göttingen, and he. In his law of another 4-volume works, the Germans, but of the law of Moses, he talks about the fact that the Jews should not be. He engages in a really pointed dispute with Moses Mendelssohn over the emancipation of the Jews. Says they can't be emancipated, and one of the main reasons they can't be emancipated, he says, is because they won't eat with us, and there can be therefore no social interaction between Germans and Jews. And then he actually says that we have developed an Erziehungsabscheu, which means a learned disgust of each other's foods. So it's not.
And he also says something very interesting.
Yeah.
Which is that if he saw a Jew eating pork, he wouldn't trust the Jew. So he sort of got it either way.
If they were
either
really,
you're
he says
a
if they
radical
were really
separationist, or you're untrustworthy.
Exactly.
Because you're doing exactly.
You can't win. If they were really like us, they would eat pork. But if they ate pork, then I can't trust what's in his heart. Is what he says.
Okay. So I want to get underneath this because going back to the Lahavdil,
sure.
In the sense of to distinguish, because when I read that one word sort of summation of the Jews' social norms and tendencies, I immediately think of a somewhat earlier and extremely notable and notorious Jewish figure by the name of Baruch Benedictus Spinoza, who in the famous third chapter of the Theological Political Treatise
Yeah.
talks about the Jews' tendency to separate themselves as a catalyst to anti-Semitism, which then has the ironic effect of preserving and fortifying the Jews' own strong sense of collective self-identity. So that's kind of the logic chain. And there he focuses particularly on the ritual practice of Brit Milah,
Brit Milah,
circumcision.
exactly. Yeah.
And there is a constant play between these two ritual practices.
Exactly.
Shechita, right?
Yeah.
Slaughter and ritual practice as drivers of campaigns to prohibit them. And as you would probably say, as a sort of masking in very minimal fashion real anti-Jewish sensibilities. These two ritual practices that involve the use of a knife as a
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So
and the shedding of blood.
And shedding of blood. So in prescribed ritual fashion. So that's one genealogy to follow, which is sort of that impulse to engage in ritual practice, which distinguishes you, which brings down the dismay, discontent, contempt, hatred of the Gentile, which reaffirms Jewish identity and at the same time leads to anti-Semitism. So that's a kind of whole lineage.
Yeah.
You also hinted at and talk about in the book the way in which meat is not just a separator or a segregator, it brings people together in the marketplace. So how do you understand those two vectors, right? The vector of separation and the vector of integration. Are they proceeding simultaneously, and what do they tell us?
They're proceeding simultaneously. The church's official position, and it had been this since the Middle Ages. So Innocent III the Pope has a whole diatribe against Christians eating the meat of the Jews. And what that means is, of course, is that you can't eat the rear end of a cow or a sheep because of the sciatic nerve. You're not meant to eat the sciatic nerve, but you can't throw out a third of a cow. Or any other, so it has to be sold, and this is how it's always been done, and it is still sold for non-Jewish consumption to this very day. That worked to the advantage of both the Jewish butcher and the Christian customer in meat markets, right? So the church is issuing these pronouncements from on high saying, don't eat this. And the Christian consumer is ignoring it. It's practicing the breach. So it's operating at two registers. There's the operator. There's there's below and above. So I think it's very interesting how the extent to which official church pronouncements are ignored. Right, so that's one register in which the whole question of lahavdil is addressed. Like, don't have anything to do with them. They're too different. They should remain different. They should remain apart. And then there's the popular expression, and there's nothing more. There's nothing sort of as real as having to part with cold hard cash in the marketplace to buy this, saying no, this brings me together. And so and there were a number of Jewish butchers, so also there's a social thing. We don't really have sources for this, but one can imagine in a marketplace where there are market stalls that Christian customers would have gone to the same, they would have had their preferred kosher butcher and would have bought from him. So, and this is in a world where things were, language was violent, physical acts were violent, it was not safe, it was a violent world. It was a violent world for Jews, for everyone, but for Jews. I'm not going to sort of, and yet we have these, meat is one place where the parties can come together, and where the Havdil has no place in some respects.
And yet it does, because there's no
and it's always
food
present.
item
And
upon which...
It's absolutely always present, and yet it works against itself. It works against separation, social separation.
Yeah.
And so, and the whole point of the dietary laws, right? We're not going to trace a Maimonidean, explanation here, or I'm not going to I don't buy about health concerns or anything like that. It's designed for social separation. And yet it's in the very adherence to the laws, the fact that Jews have this meat that they have to then sell because they can't eat certain parts of it, and that suits Christian customers, that it works in tandem in a contradictory way. It's designed to separate, and yet it also the social arrangement and economic arrangements around the production and sale of kosher meat brings the two parties together. And that's one of the stories.
Yeah, it's just one of the most interesting ways in which we see the multivalence, the polysemy of meat, right? You think, aha, segregate, right? But then it's, the preeminent source of commonality in the marketplace, or one of the main sources of commonality. So, you quote in the beginning of the book Roland Barthes, the great French cultural theorist, who talks about meat itself as a system of communication, a collection of images, a protocol of usages, situations, and behaviors. Yeah. And one really gets a sense of how meat functions in these multiple ways, far beyond the simple task of being a consumable item at the dinner table.
Right.
I want to talk a bit about sources, because we touched upon these ethnographies. I hope you can say more about the 75 ethnographies. But you make use of different bodies of sources that are really interesting, each unto its own, and they form the basis of discrete chapters. So you have the ethnographies, 75 ethnographies on Jewish ritual practice. Sometimes written by Jews and sometimes not, sometimes written by Christians. You have the cookbooks, and then the source base for the last chapter is often very difficult to abide. Anti-Semitic, that much of which is familiar by name, but I didn't know that de Sturmer had, this ongoing obsession with ritual slaughter, as did many other anti-Semitic organs and actors in the Nazi period. So, what was it like to traverse these different source bases, and what stands out to you about them?
Well, really, above all, it was fun. Because I'm a modernist by training and by inclination, but this book goes from the Middle Ages, and so those were the most enjoyable. It was a whole learning exercise, and it was a way to get away from sources that I was very familiar with, even though I include them as we move forward in time. And so reading the statutes of the meat markets was gripping to me. It was really, really interesting, and to see where Jews fit into this world. Because I probably came at this with the view of a modernist, of the Middle Ages, and a somewhat sort of Gretzian view, which is not quite so wrong as we may have once thought when we were in graduate school, but...
Leidens- und Leidengeschichte.
Right. So
a history of suffering, learning and suffering. The great 19th century German Jewish historian once described Jewish history, or was accused of describing Jewish history by a successor as a history of learning and suffering. So intellectual history and suffering constitute the entirety of.
Right. So that provided an enormous amount of interest and pleasure. But of course, the sources are interesting. These ethnographic sources that you mentioned, there are about 75 ethnographic sources. Almost all of them are from Germany. There's one from England or two from England, and almost all of them are written by Jewish converts. That's really interesting. They're not, how I came to Jesus testimonies. They also wrote those as well. These were from the horse's mouth, as it were. I mean, the first one is from 1530, and it's written by, and it's really hostile, and it's written by the grandson of the chief rabbi of Regensburg. I don't really know, I wish I did, what happened, what was in the drinking water, what it was that made these erstwhile German Jews, not only convert in the numbers that they did, but then write these incredibly vicious, but really valuable, because they're really valuable because they do describe things like the life cycle events and the kitchen, the kosher kitchen, the way it's laid out, the whole choreography of the Jewish household, that kind of thing. That's how they grew up. So they become very valuable sources. The cookbooks were a pure pleasure because that chapter has a very gendered. I mean, it was a way of introducing gender into the chapter, and women are very much, they're the voices of the chapter. They write the books. They go through multiple editions. They are, as I said, they're gigantic, they're huge, and they really provide a view onto family life, right? So much of the rest of the book doesn't really allow for that story. I mean, the story about meat is such that it touches on all of these different aspects. So if you approach it with a broad lens rather than a narrow lens, it can take you into the marketplace, it can take you into the home, it can take you into a confrontation with a really vicious and determined anti-Semitic government. It seems, I used it as a means to explore these different moments, I think, in the German Jewish past. It has a story unto itself, but it also opens up the story in ways that I didn't, like anyone, you start a book and oh, is there enough here? Yeah, maybe I've got enough for an article, maybe 2 articles, but it turned out that there was enough for a book, and I probably left stuff out as well because it was getting too long. But it appears everywhere, and you couldn't write this story about other places. I think that's another important thing.
Okay.
The sources, there are so many sources.
I want
that
to
come
pick
from
up on other places.
Yeah, okay.
By asking my final question, then we'll open up.
Yeah.
My final question begins by asking about Switzerland as the site of sort of the most successful first anti-Schita, anti-ritual slaughter legislation.
Yes.
So I want to know about what we can make of that, given that there's an inclination in the book to connect, based on your exhaustive reading of the sources, anti-ritual slaughter legislation with anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And I want to ask about how sweeping the brush should be when we think of sort of anti-ritual slaughter and adjacent efforts like anti-vivisection movements, pro-animal rights, pro-vegetarian movements that are all occurring around the same time.
Exactly.
And they're all kind of overlapping and intersecting. So the final question I'm going to ask is Switzerland, the Swiss exception, which then is followed by the Germans in the Nazi period on April 21st.
Right.
And then how we'd understand those other movements. Like, I think you want to say something like, other than every pro-vegetarian, pro-animal rights person became an anti-Semite. You're not subscribing to that view.
No.
But what can we say about the conjuncture of these different movements? Anti-ritual slaughter, pro-animal rights, pro-vegetarian,
Right.
Anti-vivisection.
So what were called humane societies, which is like animal rights societies, animal protection societies, begin around the 1840s. So just a little bit before the first campaign, which in Switzerland, which is 1854. But what we see is sort of an unholy alliance between animal rights societies and anti-Semitic politicians. They form a common currency and common cause, fortify each other, and are very well organised. I mean, at one point in one of the campaigns in Berlin, they distributed over 4 million anti-Schritter leaflets. So there's money behind it as well, right? A lot of organisational power. So there were serious problems with animal slaughter in European cities in the 19th century. It's one of the reasons why there are major reforms in big cities like in Paris,
by major problems,
in Vienna.
What do you mean?
Oh, just terrible conditions. Animals really mistreated, viciously so. They were brutal places, and so all over Europe, new and modern facilities were built to try and improve the situation. I'm not sure that it improved it so much, but into that debate, and this is another form of allyship, I would say, in the attempts to get rid of Schritter, Jews put together what are called in German Gutachten. Gutachten are essentially reports, testimonies. And they got testimonies from professors of veterinary medicine from all over Europe to pass judgment on which method of animal slaughter, the Christian method,
Maybe just say a word
which
about,
involves
maybe just say a
stunning.
word about this.
Yeah,
the different methods.
so the question about getting rid of kosher slaughter was always, well, you could do whatever you like to the animal. You can dispatch the animal in any way you like, I should say, but only after the animal has been stunned. Now, kosher slaughter forbids stunning an animal. It is killed in one fell swoop with a very large blade, a knife called a chalaf. The blade is about so long, and it goes from one side of the jugular to the other. There's a tremendous, what's called in one of the sources, an exsanguinous torrent, a big flow of blood, and the animal is rendered sort of unconscious within a few seconds. And there were studies done all over Europe, going into abattoirs, timing how long it takes. Stunning in the 19th century involved essentially multiple sledgehammer hits to the head of an animal. There were other forms, but they were always violent. There were bolt guns and masks and things like that they put over the animal's
Of which
head.
you can see
Yeah,
artistic
there are
renderings
pictures in
the
there
book.
because I took pictures
Should be
from
interesting.
abattoir supply companies who provided the implements. And there was a tremendous amount of support among the scientific community for what was called in German the kosher Schnitt, the kosher cut. And the kosher cut, as I just described to you, was used by Christian butchers who charged more for their meat. Some in these abattoirs, what you would do is you would rent a space in these abattoirs, and butchers would come in, and this would be their area. Because they were selling meat that didn't have as much blood in it, so people were getting more value for their money with not buying huge amounts of blood, but they were buying meat that had been drained of blood. And many of them swore by it, and that it tasted better, and that it remained, it was less subject, this is a world sort of pre-refrigeration, so it was less subject to going bad as quickly in the summer. the less blood it had in it. So there was a lot to recommend it from an economic point of view, from a gustatory point of view, and then also from the point of view of welfare, animal welfare. And so this is another form of cooperation where so the fellow leading the charge in Switzerland was a rabbi that we know who was also a great historian of Sephardic Jewry, Meyer Kaiserling, and Kaiserling got together one of these first, Gutachten, in which he assembled, testimonies from all over Europe to support kosher slaughter. So
there was this intense polemical battle over whether kosher slaughter was less cruel to the animal than not, and so many intellectuals, physicians, veterinarians, rabble-rousers were brought into that polemic.
Exactly.
A huge body of literature.
Exactly. And also, since the Middle Ages, one other thing is the ritual murder charge, where Jews were accused of killing Christian children, always saw the local butcher arrested, because the local butcher was said to have the means, the tools, the implements, was used to shedding blood, had a knowledge of anatomy. I mean, all this nonsense. But it must have been terrifying in these towns, like in Konitz. At the end of the 19th century, in Central Europe, there were 75 ritual murder cases. 79 ritual murder cases. So I suggest you read Helmut Walser Smith's The Butcher's Tale. If you haven't, it's an important and very wonderful read.
Uplifting.
What's that?
Uplifting.
Well, depends who you are. I found it uplifting. It's beautifully written, but it really does read like the detective story that it is. So there's another link there between criminality and kosher slaughter, or accusations of criminality and kosher slaughter.
Okay, why don't we open up for questions from our audience assembled around the table? And yes, Namit. Maybe just introduce yourself and say.
I'm Namit. I'm a doctoral candidate in the English department at a different UC, but I studied Jewish literature.
Okay.
And I was
It shall not remain unnamed.
What?
That UC should not remain unnamed.
Yes.
Yeah, there's no reason, but UC Irvine, we'll put on the table.
Irvine,
Sorry,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
I was trying to speed up the intro part to get the question. But I was thinking, when you said it couldn't be told of any other place other than Germany, and I was thinking about when I've been to Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, how central meat is. And it happens to be, my grandmother's from Hungary, and this food she's passed down is something called falsa fish. And it's actually chicken balls that look like gefilte fish. Yeah. And so to me, I'm thinking, they were prizing fish and they couldn't get fish, and so they made it a chicken. And I'm thinking, but when you said, this is particularly German? Is it because meat was so prized in Germany, or is there something else about German culture, or the resources, the archives were available, or?
Well, as I said, meat is prized. So meat consumption triples over the course of the 19th century. So by 1900, Germans are eating. They're eating about 25 pounds of meat in 1800, about 50 pounds, and then about 114 pounds per annum each of meat. It's not a big fish-eating country. They don't particularly like it. I mean, most of the country's landlocked, but why they don't, I don't know. But I can tell you that one part of the book, the chapter on Nazi Germany, Goering had to go on the radio 3 times to encourage Germans to eat fish instead of meat, because there were meat shortages. And in one of the Orthodox Jewish newspapers, they had to do something similar, where they had a heading that says, I'll translate it for you, but it says, "Fisch ist auch Fleisch." Fish is also meat. And it was written by a doctor, because they're the only people that German Jews would trust. And he explained that the level, the amount of protein in fish was equal to that of meat, and that you shouldn't be afraid of it. And it didn't go well.
So meat was particular to Germany.
Meat was meat. Yes, they love their meat. So that's another aspect to this story, is that you have two very meat-centric cultures on the same soil meeting each other. So the Germans just consume huge amounts of meat. They love meat, and the Jews have, created an entire legal edifice around meat. So that also adds another dimension, a particular dimension to this. If the Jews were in a country where there was less meat eaten, like I don't know, Italy or something like that, you just don't. It doesn't rise to the same level of people getting exercised about what the Jews are eating or what the Jews are doing. Or you also don't have in other countries the advent of new forms of Judaism that have to take up issues of temple sacrifice in the liturgy and prayers like that. So all of these things take place in Germany that don't have an analogue anywhere else, because it's a country of firsts, and like the first place where we see a lot of things, and they revolve around meat.
On the question of Germany, I'm wondering if you could specify the bounds of the Germany you're thinking of, because there are various iterations of German states over the course of this period, and Germans are spread throughout Central Europe.
Yeah.
And on that question as well, I'm fascinated in the confessional divide, especially between what's going on in sort of more Protestant-heavy northern Germany and southern Germany.
So so I deal with Switzerland, right? And mostly Germany, and to some extent Austria a little later on in the book. In Switzerland, when they introduced, when the attempt was to get rid of kosher slaughter, it was subject to a referendum. That's the way they do things in Switzerland, right? When it was going to entail a change in the national constitution. And it passed the day, but the vote was highest in Lutheran Switzerland, among the German population, and it was lower among Catholics in German-speaking Europe, and lower again among the French, and the lowest was among the Italian Catholics in Switzerland. But by far, sort of off the charts, Lutheran Protestant Switzerland had the greatest advocacy for getting rid of Schrittau. So, and that has an analogue in the German parliament as well. So the Catholic Centre Party, led by the great Ludwig Windthorst, who was himself the head of this Catholic Centre Party, but was truly dedicated. And I can't say this about even the Catholic Centre Party deputies that followed him. A lot of them were still anti-Semitic, but he was.
It's one of the real surprises of the book.
Exactly. I mean,
to see how robust his defense on principled grounds, not just utilitarian.
It wasn't utilitarian. I mean, it wasn't just utilitarian.
A Catholic delegate supporting Jewish ritual slaughter on the grounds of religious tolerance.
Exactly. So I went in with my own assumptions. Let's put it that way. If you want prejudices, I just assumed the Catholics would be pretty bad with this, and I don't know why I would have thought that the Protestants would have been more liberal, but that was sort of my ignorance. But it turned out to be exactly the opposite, and so it was really the Catholic Centre Party that helped save the day, because he was such a towering figure, and it was such an important party. The Catholic Centre Party still is, in its own version today.
So Alex also asked about the geographic permutations of that concept known as Germany.
Yeah.
And
So
how did
German-speaking
you
Europe.
understand German-speaking Europe?
German-speaking Europe.
You know, what you seem to be pointing to, I mean, quite explicitly,
Yeah.
is, to borrow a term of art,
Yeah.
a German Sonderweg when
Yes.
it comes to,
I am.
you know,
I am.
a special German path that makes it an outlier, both in terms of the consumption of meat and in terms of the stigmatization of various methods, or the linking of sort of the method of slaughter and anti-Semitism.
I see no analog. I mean, there's a Sonderweg. It's different. It's different, and but I really do want to stress that it's different in good ways as well, because there's cooperation. There's, you know, anti-Semitism runs like a red thread through the book, but so too does cooperation. I really have to keep stressing that because people tend to focus
in the marketplace,
in the parliament,
Mm-hmm.
with 19th century butchers selling kosher meat to local Jewish villages because the place can't support a kosher butcher shop. Lots of places in lots of ways. With the professors of veterinary medicine supporting the campaigns to, you know, in defense of Schritta. That's also part of the Sonderweg. It doesn't always have to lead to Auschwitz. I mean, that's what the Sonderweg thesis from the 1980s, the historical thesis from the 1980s. There was a challenge to the issue whether Germany was different from the rest of, you know, liberal Western Europe.
How to explain the genesis of the final solution in Germany as opposed to Poland, as opposed to Ukraine. Some historians came up with the idea that there was a special German way or path known as the Sonderweg, and it's a term that's applicable, but not necessarily in the context in which it first
It was
came to
only meant
prominence.
to be. It was only meant to be bad.
Yeah.
To describe, you know, how you got, you know, from Goethe and Schiller to Auschwitz. Right. But
Natalie.
there's more.
Yeah, Natalie.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm a PhD candidate in the history department. I have a question based on some of my ethnographic experiences that I had when I was in Morocco.
So just say a word about what you do. So
I
nobody's-
worked on Tangier during World War II, working on urban history and Jewish history.
Okay.
So this like ethnographic experience was before I started my research, but I bought a Jewish cookbook in Essaouira in southern Morocco, and I brought it back home with me when I lived in Casablanca. And I just, you know, had it in my living room, and a Moroccan friend, not Jewish, picked up the cookbook and you know, flipped through it, and she was like, "Why is this called a Moroccan Jewish cookbook? This is just Moroccan food." So that sort of shed light for me on how this question of difference, like what makes this food Jewish, what makes this food different. And so it seemed like almost the opposite of what you were saying about how in the German context these cookbooks might accentuate the difference of Jews, whereas I feel like, at least in this example, there's actually a question of like the Moroccan Jews actually aren't that different than us. They might use kosher meat, but otherwise they eat the same things as we do. So I think about that a lot, and I think one other thing is about the question of myth making, because I also found anecdotally that there are a lot of Moroccan foods that are known to have a Jewish origin, and no one knows why. So a food called bastila that comes from maybe like Andalus or something, and everyone said like, oh, we eat that because the Jews taught us that. And you know, you ask for some sources or proof, and you know, no one knows. But there's a lot of examples of that. So I guess obviously quite different historical and geographic context. But I'm curious about this question of the accentuation of difference. If that was true in other sources in addition to the one you mentioned. also if there is the role of myth making at all around Jewish food. Totally separate. I'm also just thinking about the production and labor side of things, and I'm sure that comes through. But I'm curious for any reflections on any of this. And yeah, it sounds like a great book. I'm excited to read it.
All right, so accentuation, myth making, and production and labor.
Sorry,
Okay.
all
right.
free to choose. And, yeah, it's a lot of threads.
So no, look, it's a really good question. If you were just to open the book, open one of these cookbooks, not to a section that says Passover foods, right? So that's one answer to one response to you, or Sabbath foods, right? So there are those sections, but just normal foods. You would say, oh, these look pretty German, like beer soup, right? With dumplings, right? Of course.
There are in Jewish cookbooks.
In Jewish cookbooks.
Beer
Yeah,
soup.
yeah. But most important, let me see if I can.
You looking for the book?
No, not the book. Just give me. But most important, what is the source or the reference that you're looking in to make this soup, if you need to make it, and it's in a Jewish cookbook. And these cookbooks sold in very large numbers, and I assume 99% of them to Jewish families, because it was a Jewish cookbook, and it said, usually didn't use the word Jewish on the front cover, but Israelitisches or something like that, and that's what made it Jewish. That's how you distinguished it from just a non-Jewish cookbook. Of course, they're all kosher. That's the other thing. Yeah, so that's the next point that I was going to make. It's another tell, right? They are all kosher, strictly kosher, and they tend to have forwards in them that explain. They're very often made for targeted at young brides as a gift, a wedding gift for them. And it tells them how to kosher meat, how to keep a kosher kitchen. Their instruction, they're didactic as well, right? They're full of instruction. So there's plenty in there. One of the books which was a bestseller, and this is again, this goes into the realm of stereotype, but only in Germany. It has a 100-page essay written by an Orthodox Jewish physician on the health benefits of kashrut, right?
In a cookbook.
Yeah, in a cookbook. Mm-hmm. In a cookbook. And it was a scholarly piece that he had already published in a medical journal. So there's the whole thing about science as well that plays into this, right? And so there's a certain pride in the. I think the German Jews felt in the gathering together of all of this knowledge about cuisine and food and what they ate. And when it appears between two covers with a nice illustration on the front, etc., and they won many awards, by the way, at international food festivals and things like that. They're really impressive books. There was a certain ethnic pride, I think, to going into a bookshop and buying one of these things and taking it home, even if it wasn't necessarily used as a working cookbook. It's something that was to be found in a Jewish household. And as I say, I think 99% of them were sold to Jews. So that's what makes them Jewish, even if the recipes may be very German. Or not maybe, they were. And there are sections in there. There are sections in there that they would, for things like gefilte fish and things like that. So from Eastern Europe as well, that they would have that they also ate.
You want to say the myth making, the myth of foodways and their origin? Is there anything that you encountered?
The myth of foodways and their origin. So I have a section in that chapter on non-meat subjects, because Germany becomes really the first place where there's any sort of Jewish food history written. And they tackle things like the German Jews didn't use the word challah for the bread that's eaten on a Friday night. They used the word bachas. And it's unclear where it's from. There were...
There's an obvious...
What's that?
There's an obvious
There is,
Hebrew etymological connection.
but when you read the
talk about,
sources,
which you talk about.
yeah, which I talk about, right? But it could have gone in a number of different directions, and there's disagreements among sort of anthropologists and these historians about where the food is from. But it speaks to something that's unique, and it was an important way of distinguishing them from other Jewish communities, particularly Eastern Europe, because the word bachas doesn't exist anywhere else for challah. Challah is challah. So there are these, and then there are other things that we have, and there's stuff that I have in there on sort of medieval food and medieval food that appears, questions about food that appears from German rabbis that appear in responsa literature about baking. Pies were big in the Middle Ages, so the question like stuff in pastry. And there's only one oven, right? So how long do you have to wait before you bake something with meat in it, after you've baked a cheese pie or that kind of thing? So those are questions that are very specifically Jewish, that don't go to the modern ones, but it made me think that there's a long story that you can trace the very specifics of in Germany of dealing with foodstuffs.
Rachel, maybe. Oh, we have two questions, I think. How many? Anyone else? Oh, okay, we have three questions. We're going to take them all in one fell swoop. Mm-hmm. Not to distinguish that from the previous use of that expression. And we'll ask John to hold off and just answer after everybody's asked their question. Here's a pen if you want a pen.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, first
So Rachel, honey, and...
Hi, I'm Rachel.
Hi.
I wanted to ask what the etymology of that word is.
Well, the most obvious would be from the Hebrew word for blessing, bracha. And John talks about that. Say what you do. Say what you do.
Oh, I'm a master's student in library information studies. I'm interested in German Jewish archives.
Okay.
And I was wondering about the milk part of, does that just play second fiddle to the meat? Like obviously you wrote primarily about meat, but I'm just curious.
In the cookbooks and elsewhere,
In the
perhaps.
cookbook, yeah.
Where's
In
the
the
milk?
dairy- in
Where's
the-
the milchik in the story?
Yeah.
Oh, it's
All right, so hold off. Just write it
Okay,
down.
okay.
You have time to think about where's the milchik in the story.
Okay.
Honey, introduce
So
yourself if you don't mind.
I'm Khani. I'm a PhD student in history here. So I was going to ask about the gender in the story. I'm curious about, I have a lot of questions, but I'll focus just on the gender. The space of the marketplace, who's doing the shopping, who's doing the vending, sort of how does gender shape the market? So I'm curious about that. And then I'm curious about the image of the Jewish butcher. You said that there's this notion that they're unclean, that they're murderous and dangerous. I'm curious sort of with also this image of the menstruating Jewish man and this blood in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Is the Jewish butcher, like a virile figure or also sort of feminized in this context?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, maybe we'll hold off on that, because I know you'll have more time to post. Neely, introduce yourself.
I'm Neely. I'm an undergraduate student in Professor Meyer's Modern Jewish History class.
Okay.
And my question's pretty quick. I was just curious about, you mentioned the like that Jews got assessments from like medical professors about like shchita
Yes.
And its cruelty on animals.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if there was like a prevailing result, like a common result, like throughout those assessments, and like if that helped with the fight against anti-shchita legislation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's stunningly few recipes that are milk-based, dairy recipes. Stunningly few.
In the cookbooks.
In the cookbooks, yeah. Yeah. there's just not a lot. I mean, Germans also are not just generally speaking, are not huge cheese eaters. Like, you know, the Italians eat a lot more cheese, the French certainly, and the English certainly eat much more cheese. They don't have as rich a cheese culture as those other places in Western Europe. And the further east you go, that tends to be the case, from Germany to the east. So at one point in the book, I mean, I took one of these very big cookbooks and counted the recipes, and it was sort of like, you know, 80 different recipes for beef, and, you know, and all the vegetarian dishes had some sort of broth in them, or you know, vegetables were fried in animal fat. It was just a common. It was a common thing. Oh, one of the things that's I've forgotten your name. I'm sorry, but yeah. So one of the things that everyone comments on, opponents of Jewish emancipation, Jews themselves, that you needed cooking oil, you needed cooking fat, and the cooking fat of choice for Jews, because the cooking fat for Christians was lard. The equivalent for Jews is goose fat, goose schmaltz, and Jews loved goose. That was a Central European delicacy, absolutely. So that's something that's still, well, it's a way of answering your question. There's just very little in terms of dairy dishes. They're all sort of meat-based.
Are there, with dairy dishes, are there as strict regiments about, like, preparation as there are with meat? Or, like,
just that they shouldn't be mixed.
But there's not, like, it seems that there's more specific guidelines for...
Well, meat is more complex than cheese.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, just the preparation of, you know, it's not just a matter of the way the animal is killed. It's then, it's called, it has to be koshered. And to kosher the meat, that is to make it kosher, but the verb is to kosher, involves salting and soaking with a board on a 45-degree angle. And I mean, it's quite complex, and the same rules don't apply to dairy. Gender. So, yes, it would have been women. So it's men are the butchers and men sell. In the modern period, some of the depictions that we see are the butcher and his wife, who work together in their butcher shop or whatever and sell together. But it would have been women who go to the marketplace. So the butcher the butcher is always in both sort of anti-Semitic representations and non-anti-Semitic representations by virtue of the fact of their job. They counter the image of the weak, effeminate Jewish male. They're all really robust. In fact, I describe the butchers in one of the pictures where they're incredibly muscular because they're holding down this huge cow with ropes, and it's heavy work. You know, it's serious work. So they also don't conform, to the anti-Semitic stereotype of the Jewish male. And then, of course, and in all the anti-Semitic representations, visual representations, but even in the one by Schutt where there isn't a drawing but there's a description, they tend to be big and burly, and the Nazis always made them very hairy. They're ugly representations, but But they're very different in their representation to the way they represented Jewish males generally, which tended to be as the weak and effeminate, or fat, but also, you know, totally out of shape. But these are sort of burly and stronger.
Okay, maybe just take a minute to respond to the Gutacht.
Yeah. There was a question about the
question
Jewish.
was,
Which I answered, yeah. The Gutachten. Remind me the question. I'm sorry, I wrote.
I was just wondering if there was like a common result that came from like these assessments, and if it helped in the.
So they were big. There were hundreds of testimonies that were given in support of Shchita. Look, if someone was part of the anti-Shchita, anti-kosher slaughter circle and campaign, there was nothing that was going to convince them or change their mind. So it didn't really have an effect. And in fact, the scientific argument tended to be ignored, which was ironic in a country that was a leading purveyor of science. What saved the day for Shchita in the 19th century was falling back on the liberal principles of freedom of religion. That's what carried the day.
Is it the case the preponderance of opinions would be in favor of, would be opposed to the legislation? That's sort of what I learned. Like the preponderance of scientific opinion did not uphold the claim that Shchita was
not
cruel.
only were they in favor of Shchita, they frequently condemned Christian
Think
slaughter.
of the quantitative. From what you read, would
Most
that
of
be
them,
the
no, most of them,
preponderance?
most of them, yeah, most of them, and with Meyer Kaiserling, he said, look, it's the Christians who are raising this problem. It's for them to solve, and I'm only going to speak to Christians about this. And he said, let the chips fall where they may in terms of the results. And then he counted the results, and you can read the results, and they were, unanimously in favour of it. I mean, it was the conditions in the abattoirs were terrible, and they were brutally cruel for the animals.
Including amongst Jewish butchers?
No, because of the, just the hammering of the skulls.
The stunning.
Yeah, the stunning.
Okay.
And it's still the case. I mean, it's different now. They use sort of more electricity.
Needless to say, these debates continue.
The debates continue.
As you suggested, now there's halal.
Halal is different. Halal, I'll just maybe say, halal is interesting. There are some imams who have said that stunning is permissible. Mm-hmm. That opens the door to shows a sort of from the point of view of Christians, it's a chink in the Islamic armor, as it were, because they've opened the door to the permissibility of it. There was no one on the Jewish side who said stunning is possible, right? So it was so the debate was much more clearly defined when it came to Jews because there was no one breaking with the ranks. So there were some who said, we shouldn't have it, we don't need it, but there was no one who said, maybe we could do this, maybe we can do that.
Okay, what I'll say is this is an incredibly rich account of a really important subject, maybe even surprisingly so for some of us, and you can purchase a copy of the book right over there, should you choose, but whether you do or don't, I know you will join me in thanking John Efron for most stimulating. Thank you very much. Thank you.